Hello, everybody, and welcome to One Question with Pastor Adam. And I am Adam, and I am pastor to believers and to doubters, to unfaithful Christians and to faithful atheists. And friends, Jesus wasn't afraid of questions, and neither are we here at One Question with Pastor Adam. So we are going to go through the questions. And many of you know that I have been on a bit of a mission to reclaim Paul as actually, surprisingly to many of us, Paul as somebody who was progressive during his time. Now, I know that this is a modern concept or a modern term that I am imposing upon Paul of the first century, but I don't care, people. Here we go. Paul actually was leading forward in line with what Christ was doing. And we have had so many misconceptions of Paul. And I have been on this kind of mission to reclaim Paul from forces that I think have stolen his message and turned it into something that it wasn't meant to be. So we're going to continue this mission today. Hi, Emily. Yo, what's up? Jesus likes it when Adam answers questions. Thank you, Emily. Yes. And today we have a good friend of mine from seminary and becoming a bit of a regular on the show, Dr. Ryan Hansen. And Ryan and I met, I don't know, 15 years ago at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where we were both getting Masters of Theological Studies. So Ryan focused on the book of Revelation, which we talked about last month or a month and a half ago. So you can check that out if you're interested in the book of Revelation. But today we are going to talk about Paul, and specifically kind of this word that Paul uses called the flesh. And I was going to title this episode, "Was Paul a fuddy-duddy?" That's the technical theological term that I learned in New Testament back in seminary with Ryan. So was Paul a fuddy-duddy? No. The question is, what did Paul mean by flesh? Was Paul against the flesh? Did Paul think the flesh was evil? Because we have a lot of forces today in Christianity that kind of have a dualistic view of Paul's term of the flesh. Your bodies are evil. Your flesh and your body is evil, and you have to have this other thing called spirit in order for you to transcend the evil impulses of your bodies. And I think this is a misconception of what Paul was saying of the flesh, and I think Ryan agrees with me. So we're gonna bring Dr. Ryan Hansen in, and Jessica says Paul the fuddy-duddy. So we'll see if we can reclaim Paul as not the fuddy-duddy, but Paul the progressive-ish. That's my phrase. I don't know if Ryan would go so far as saying that Paul was progressive, but Paul who is pushing us forward in a very positive way. So I'll bring Ryan in now. So here we go. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Adam.
Welcome back to the show. It's always good to see you.
Well, thank you. I'm really happy to be back. I appreciate the chance to speak with you.
It's always fun. And friends, if you've got questions or comments about anything related to Paul or whatever, you can bring those in. Paul and women, Paul and homosexuality, all of the questions that we have for Paul. But this is kind of a basic question that goes along with Paul and women and Paul and our LGBTQ siblings. This might be kind of an underlying issue when it comes to all of the things that we talk about with Paul, all of the things that make us think that Paul is problematic, right? What did Paul mean by the flesh? Is the flesh evil for Paul? Is it something that we have to transcend to get over? Or is the flesh or human bodies somehow related to Genesis chapter 1, where God creates the world and even humans, and human bodies are good, right? In Genesis chapter 1. Does Paul go away from that, or is he consistent with that? Ryan, give us all the answers.
Well, I can't promise all the answers, but it's a fantastic question. I think it's a really important question to ask. because there are certain things about a North American or more Western in general way of seeing the scriptural text that can maybe cause us to miss or even distort some things in Paul. Um, and I think the flesh is one of those things. So, and it has all kinds of implications for how we think about salvation, how we think about how Paul thought about salvation. Um, and I know particularly for myself growing up, um, this was shaped by the older translation the NIV did, when they translated what is sarx in Greek. When we read flesh, that's the Greek word. They translated that in almost all cases as sinful nature.
Mm,
And thankfully, in the 2011 revision of the NIV, they have gone back to the flesh, which doesn't solve all our problems because we still import problematic aspects to that language. But to equate the flesh with sinful nature, I think is a major problem,
okay.
because this then starts us down the path of thinking embodied existence is the problem. Our life on earth is the problem. And the solution then is we've got to get out of, for lack of, or to be crass, right? We've got to get out of the meat suits
Mm,
and become disembodied spirits, um, and escape from gravity and escape from earth and
yeah.
go live someplace else in heaven. And that's the vision of salvation and the goal of salvation that Paul is getting at. That's kind of where we head when we start thinking about embodied existence is the problem. And that's in a lot of ways, that's probably a lot of how I thought about salvation growing up. Just that's kind of the cultural water. But the problem is when I went back and started reading the text really carefully, when I started to get trained by professional biblical scholars to read carefully, to read critically, to ask questions of original languages and ancient culture, really that mindset doesn't make sense of much in Paul. It doesn't make sense of much in Revelation. It doesn't make sense of much of Scripture in general. This idea of escape, uh, because in general, I think the whole biblical trajectory is not us escaping out of uh, our createdness, but
Mm,
God coming deeper and deeper in to uh, dwell with us. So this kind of escaping idea, this disembodiment idea, doesn't work for the incarnation. It doesn't work with Genesis, as you pointed
yeah.
out. So I think we've got to try to at least clear some of those preconceptions away about the flesh.
Well, I think one of the things that we really struggle with is something like maybe original sin, which is this kind of idea. I don't know, maybe crassly put, maybe the straw man for original sin is you are inherently evil. And you were born inherently evil, and your flesh is evil. And as you say, it's something that you have to escape through the spirit or
Mhm.
something, right?
Yeah.
This kind of dualism that
Right.
original sin often comes with, at least in its modern understanding.
Mhm.
I think there's something to. I think that there's a way that you can interpret original sin, and maybe Paul, when he talks about the flesh as well, as kind of this thing that this way of being human that leads to rivalry, that leads to antagonism over defining ourselves over and against another person. Uh, and this might, I mean, it's just kind of unfortunately a way that we develop as being human. And when Paul talks about the flesh in First Corinthians chapter 3, for example,
Yeah.
he brings up some of you follow Paul and some of you follow Apollos, and you're in this big conflict about which one we're supposed to follow. And we don't really know who Apollos was today, right? Do we? It's just some kind of strange leader of the early church who had some kind of rivalry with Paul. And Paul here is saying, hey guys, you're missing the point when you get into these kinds of rivalries and antagonisms with each other. And in that context, he talks about the flesh.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's not your body per se, but
Mhm.
it's just kind of a way of being in the world where it leads to rivalry, antagonism. Does that make some kind of sense of
Yeah,
maybe
I
what
think
Paul's getting at?
the other problem is that Paul will use flesh in various places
Uh,
with slightly different nuances, right? So that gets us into trouble too. So right there, right, there's like a rivalry aspect to it. There's a mindset aspect to it. Whereas he also will have a sustained conversation on the flesh in Romans and Galatians, and there are certain things going on there that may not exactly be going on in First Corinthians. Not that they're completely different, but there's
sure.
different nuances. So that makes it tricky too. Is we can't just like do a word search and then assume that it's the same thing happening every time he uses that word. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that's tricky about what Paul uses when he talks about the problems of the flesh is that a lot of those problems that he brings up are things that he falls into in his life.
Hmm.
Like in Galatians chapter 5, he talks about the works of the flesh are obvious, and he talks about strife and enmity and quarrels and dissensions, right? And Paul falls into those things throughout his ministry because he thinks that he sees other people not living into the gospel, and he kind of brings them out. I mean, one of the biggest strifes, quarrels of the early church, maybe the biggest one, the first one was and what Paul was so concerned about was whether Gentiles are included as Gentiles into the community, right? And it seems as though there were some people who like wanted Gentiles to uh, follow the law of circumcision. And Paul got into this like big strife and quarrels with them, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's interesting. Like Paul is a bombastic uh, rhetorician, right? He's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
don't try to get into an argument against Paul because he knows all the rhetorical tricks. He will
Hmm.
argue circles around you. Um, but yeah, I think he's constantly having to deal with um, arguments from opponents of his, or he's having to work on helping churches who are having arguments amongst themselves, right? And I think that's one of the aspects of Romans that we tend to not see, that this is a church that's not getting along. And really, the whole
Yeah.
way along, he's trying to help them be one, live together.
I've I've never heard of a church that didn't get along.
Right.
Glad we've progressed so far. What's happening in the church in Rome that they're not getting along?
Um, Well, it seems to be well, this is a complex thing that maybe we'll save the deep dive into Romans for another conversation, but
Yeah. Yeah.
they seem to have different practices.
Mm.
And it's not just Jews and Gentiles. It could be it's not maybe neatly divided into those camps. It could be Jews and Gentiles on one side, some Jews and Gentiles on one side, and some other Jews and Gentiles on another side, about practices, religious
Oh,
practices, eating together, following other kinds of religious observances. Um, yeah, so that they're having trouble uh, living living that way. Um, and so usually we get like to Romans 8 and kind of stop there. And if we're really interested in the conversation on predestination, we might read Romans
mhm,
9 through 11. Everybody's favorite life verse is Romans 12, 1 and 2. And
mm.
then a government treatise in Romans 13, which really isn't a government, and then we're lucky if we ever read Romans 14 and 15. But I think Romans 14 and 15 is the reason Paul wrote the letter, because
Okay.
those are the instructions about how to be the community in light of what God has done in Jesus, that he's been spelling out in all of those chapters. 1 through 11, and then also 12 and 13. In light of that work that God has done, how is this community to live together, to make space for one another, he says,
Mm.
welcome one another just as Christ has welcomed you, right? And the just as Christ has welcomed you part is Romans 1 through 13, right?
So
So
as
he spelled
part,
that out, and he says, now, since you've been welcomed in with such gracious
mm,
hospitality by God,
oh
you
wow.
do the same for each other.
Mm,
And
mm.
sometimes we don't even read those chapters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So Paul has this radical open hospitality, this radical open welcoming
Yeah.
of the other into our midst, and that's what it means to be church.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so could you say that when Paul is part of what one Paul is talking about when it comes to the flesh and the desires of the flesh is excluding people
I
from the community?
I think that can be an aspect of it, but I think, yeah, let's get
Yeah.
into the flesh, because I think that that will be helpful if we can see, if we can clear away the negative connotations like the salvation is disembodiment and escape ideas. If we can clear those away and then start to think about what does he say about the flesh, I think that can be helpful. So,
Let's do that. Jessica says, I like having a body. I don't want embodied existence
yes,
to be the problem.
exactly.
Jessica nails it right there.
That's exactly
That's
right.
it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
So, and this will eventually, I think, we'll touch on questions of original sin too, which is that kind of terminology is systematic theology language. It's not language that
Mhm.
Paul uses. Um, I think that language can be helpful. It can also be unhelpful,
Yep.
of original sin. So we've got to do it responsibly. But um, so I feel in many ways that I'm still learning what Paul is getting at with when he talks about flesh and spirit. This has been a journey I've been on for a while, but I don't think it's helpful to see these as like bipolar,
Mm.
binary opposition kind of things. Like one is embodied, one is disembodied. It's Eugene Rogers in his book After the Spirit who says the spirit rests on bodies, right? So the spirit is all about embodiment. Um, And that's what Jesus says in the Gospels too, right? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Um, so, um,
I love that you brought up Eugene Rogers, by the way,
oh yeah,
as a queer theologian,
yeah.
right?
He's an excellent theologian. Yeah,
Yes.
so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so um, I think what's helpful to see, there's a really sustained conversation on flesh and then flesh
Mm.
and spirit in Romans 5 through 8.
Okay.
And really 6 through 8. But 5 gets at the problem. 5 kind of diagnoses what the problem is, and the problem is death.
Mm.
Um, Beverly Gaventa helped me see this. I like Beverly Gaventa is just a rock star, Pauline
Mm.
scholar. Check out everything she does, but especially Our Mother Saint Paul is a great book.
Oh.
But uh, she has another book called When in Romans, and I think one of the chapters, or at least one of the subheadings in a chapter, it just caught my attention, and it's never let me go since. It's called, she says, Death Ruled as King, which is really just a translation from Romans 5, but we don't, usually we say like death reigned or something, but I just
Mhm.
love this personification of death. Death ruled as king and death ruled as a tyrant king, really. And so in Romans 5, if we go to that, maybe it's just helpful to walk through Romans 5 through 8. Not, I won't go into great detail,
Okay.
but um, but um, Romans 5 is where Paul starts first juxtaposing the first human and the second human. I hesitate to
Mm,
use your name, Adam, but
yeah.
it's the more humanity focused. It's not necessarily like these are representatives of human families, right? The Adam,
Mm,
um,
mm.
and so
So when Paul uses the word Adam, he's talking about humanity in general, do you think?
this is it's a personification. It's like the first one of a it's first representative of a whole human family.
Kind of like an archetype?
It's an archetype, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so yeah, so in verse 12 of chapter 5, I'm reading from the NRSV, but I'm going to quibble with the NRSV in a little bit. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, um, and the NRSV says, so death spread to all because all have sinned.
Mm,
Um, I think a better translation is uh, death spread to all with the result that all have sinned. David Bentley Hart gets at this in his translation, and I think he's right that the grammar there is not uh, death spread to all because all have sinned, meaning like sin then death, but actually uh, it's like sin came into the world through one man is how Paul is reading
mhm,
the narrative here, the narrative of Genesis 3 is kind of what he's working with, um, and it kind of unlocked the door for death to come in,
mm,
and we see if you read Genesis 3, right, that's precisely what happens. Enmity and strife start happening, like the blame game happens immediately. It's
it,
the Simpsons riffs on Genesis 3 in a really funny way. Marge and Homer are Adam and Eve, and they eat the fruit, and God comes to Marge and says, "Did you eat the fruit?" And I think actually in the Simpsons, Homer ate it first.
okay.
And Marge says, Homer, what do you have to say for yourself? And he says, I think we should see other people. Right? So it's just, it's a funny riff, but it's also true. Like that, this kind of discord, not only between humans and God, but between humans and humans.
Yeah, is that kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about death in the Bible? It can be a literal physical death, but can death also be a metaphor?
I think it's a
Like
condition,
it's a
a
condition.
deathliness, right? A being towards
Okay.
death, which is a being towards if what Paul says is right. Death spread to all, right? So death came through sin. It opens the door, and death comes into the creation. The way you
Mm,
read Genesis 1 and 2, death is not there, right? God doesn't
right.
create death. God doesn't design things to die.
Mm,
God designs a world to flourish and live, um, and so it opens the door to death. Death slips in, and like a tyrant dictator takes over, right? So death spread to all. The condition of death, the deathliness, the being towards death kind of clouds everything over, which then leads to this idea of, oh my goodness, I'm going to die, I'm fearful now, I fear that
mm,
there's not enough, right? Homer says, I think we should see other people. That's a
mm,
scarcity, like I got to save my own skin.
yeah.
um, and then, if the grammar is right, and I think Hart is right on this, death spread to all, therefore, or with the result that all sinned. Right, so everyone's under the conditions of death, the deathliness, being towards death, which then leads us to actual willful uh, violations of love, violations of the
Mm,
law of love. Um, when we look out for ourselves. So that's where I do think in First Corinthians, this rivalry aspect of the flesh
okay.
definitely has those kinds of connotations when there's an understanding of scarcity. I've got to get mine. I've got to save my own skin. Forget looking out for other people. And
So
Paul
this
is all over the place here saying like, put
yeah.
others' needs above your own, right? So it's an exact reversal of that
So
self-preservation.
when so when we don't when we don't love our neighbor as we love ourselves,
Yeah.
as Leviticus 19:18 says, and Jesus quotes later, right? When we don't do that, then are we living in the ways of death? Are we
Yes.
conditioned by death?
Yes. Yes, that's our
Okay.
being towards death. And
Okay.
that is the problem then, right? So the conditions of death are, I think, what Paul identifies as the problem. Death
Mm,
ruled as a tyrant king, to
yeah.
quote Beverly Gaventa. Um, and therefore all that language about Jesus being a king makes total sense. This is about regime change.
Mm,
This is about like over dethroning death, overthrowing death's reign, and establishing the resurrected King of Life over creation in order to bless it and bestow life. So flesh, um, even though Paul doesn't get at that language here, he immediately starts talking about flesh in chapter 6, 7, and 8. And so I think we have to see what's going on in chapter 5
mm,
and read flesh in light of that. There's a book that I read about 20-ish years ago, 22 odd years ago now, that I'm not even sure if it's still in print, but if you can find it, it's really worth the
mhm,
read. It has so shaped my thinking on Paul for these 2 decades at least. Um, and I don't really know many people who deal with it or read it, but it's been so formative for me. It's Hans Walter Wolff's Anthropology of the Old Testament, um, and he uh, like the first 3 chapters are about the Old Testament terms that get translated as soul, flesh, and spirit. And those 3 chapters
mm,
just like are constantly in the back of my mind when I read Paul. Um, we kind of think of soul as disembodied, but the Hebrew word for soul was the word for throat or appetite or hunger. Um, and so it was this idea of a soul. It's the word that's used for when God breathes into the man's nostrils and he
mhm,
becomes a living being. We sometimes translate that, or a living soul. It's that word. So it means like
mm,
the whole person that's alive, breathed into by God. But it's this idea of a need. We're created for relationship. We're created to need God, um, and we're created with an appetite for God. And I think that's so
mm,
suggestive for then Genesis 3, where what is the sin imaged as eating something else, right? And
mm,
I think it's so
mm,
suggestive for Eucharist, and it's just a lovely
yeah.
word. Um, but
Mm,
then he moves on to flesh, and he titles that uh, chapter on flesh. The Hebrew word is basar. Basar is how we would spell it in with our English letters. Basar is the human being in infirmity. So it's not
mm,
coded with morality, right? It's not coded negatively morality. It's not like, oh, flesh is sinful, but rather flesh is infirm. Flesh is frail. And so if we are needy, right? If we are soul, that word for hunger, if we move away from the source of our life, we're going to be frail. It's kind of like, if you're
mm,
on a life support system and you don't have that system, your body's going to shut down, kind of thing. Um, and then that next word is spirit, which is, again, not disembodied, but he titles that chapter uh, the human being's empowerment, right? So again, it's
mm,
not like anti-body, it's the power source for what
yeah.
embodiment really should be. And so Wolf has been so formative. So when I read Paul talking about under the conditions of death, uh, flesh is not to be coded as a moral term. It does have moral
Mm,
implications, right? Because we are frail, because we are infirm, we have impulses to self-preservation that cause us to act
yeah.
in unloving ways towards others, exploitative ways, in order to save our own skins. Um,
Mm,
but it's not. primarily a moral term. It's just kind of an ontological term. Like we are frail and we are subject to death, right? Like we can get sick and die. We can be killed. If there is, especially in the Paul's world, if there's a famine and you don't get a crop, you can starve to death. Or if you don't
Mm.
have employment and you don't have money, you can't buy food. And there's, not a whole lot of social services in the ancient Roman
Yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah. I remember one of our professors said that in the ancient world, if you got a cut and you got infected, that could lead to your death right there.
Yes.
And so, yeah, these bodies, as much as we might love our bodies and want to affirm the body, they're also very vulnerable,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, we the older we get, the more they seem to fall apart or
Yeah.
don't function as they used to, and that makes us even more vulnerable.
Yeah, and seemingly Paul himself struggled with some kind of physical infirmity. He talks about the thorn in his flesh, of all things, right?
Mm,
In
mhm.
Second Corinthians, um, and so he knows, and he was beaten and imprisoned and left for dead sometimes. So I think the problem then in Paul, the problem of flesh, is not the problem of embodiment. It's rather that our embodiment is subject to really what Paul personifies as the
Mm.
powers of sin and death. These should be capitalized. Beverly Gaventa does this too. Capitalizes
Yeah.
sin and death as like personified powers that act contrary to God's desires in creation. And
Mm.
that's why Jesus comes to liberate us from those powers into
This
the blessing of life.
this is so great. I want to hold on to that for a second. Rebecca says, "So are we talking physical death or metaphorical death?" Uh, I would answer that by saying yes. I don't know how you would answer that, Ryan, but yeah,
Yeah, I think so. I think sometimes we can over spiritualize Paul,
good.
um, in the sense of like it becomes kind of devoid of the very like physical world that we live in. And Paul's world was um, very raw. And one of the things I love about N.T. Wright's "The Day the Revolution Began" is he talks about the ancient Roman world as the world of wrath and arms, right? The first or the greatest uh, Greek poem, the first word in the greatest Greek poem is wrath, and the first word in the
Mm,
greatest uh, Roman poem is arms, weapons. So he's like, this is a world of
mm,
weapon, wrath and weapons, anger and weapons. And it's a very like Paul lives in a very visceral, physical world. So death is it's physical. Um, Now there
yeah.
is, I think he wouldn't divide the metaphorical, spiritual, and physical, right? Like there's a spiritual death, there's a being towards death that is problematic. But these
Mhm.
are wrapped up in each other.
Yeah, the metaphorical
Mhm.
and the physical are all kind of wrapped up together. Yeah, yeah. I love what you're saying because it. I'm just thinking. You brought up N.T. Wright's book, "The Day the Revolution Began." It's talking about Good Friday and the atonement, and you know, I think that some of Protestant Christianity has gone a little off the rails with the atonement and in talking about wrath
Mm.
and what Jesus came to save us from, which later in Christian history, it becomes, we think that this is the traditional view of the atonement,
Yeah.
right? That Jesus came to save us from God's wrath, right?
Right.
That's actually a later view of the atonement. The first atonements are exactly what you're talking about with Paul, is that Jesus came not to save us from God, but to save us from death. And at times, Satan gets thrown in there as well, right? So is that primarily how you view the understanding of the early church and what Jesus came to save us from, and that Paul is in line with that?
Yeah, I think so. That's the Christus Victor approach
Hmm.
that Alain eventually kind of looked at the early church. But I think that's really, I I'm very sympathetic to the apocalyptic interpretation of Paul, which is this kind of a dramatic rescue operation that's going on.
Yeah.
That's what atonement is rescuing us from the powers of sin and death, bringing us back to God, relating us rightly, right? Because we're under the powers of sin and death, we're not related rightly to God or to each other. So there is like, you know, righteousness plays into that. Atonement plays into that. I do think there is, I think you're right that later theologizing on this becomes problematic, that we're saved from God. There is talk of God's wrath in Romans. It's another discussion for another day, probably. But I think that's too often unhelpfully read. We're not saved from God's wrath. We're saved by God's love. That's what Romans
Mm.
says.
Do you see? Let's do a little bit of wrath,
Sure.
since
Yeah.
we've brought it up.
The wrath, the first mention of wrath is in chapter 1, which I don't even like the word wrath, because the etymology of it in English comes from a word that means cruelty, and I just don't think Paul
Mm.
wants to talk about the cruelty of God. Again, to go back to David Bentley Hart, who I haven't, there's a essay he wrote that I want to mention in a bit, but I haven't even mentioned that essay. But his
Mm.
translation has been so helpful of Romans 1, because he translates that word as indignation, which is
Ah,
justified anger at injustice, which I think totally fits, because in Romans 1, the wrath of God has been revealed against all kinds of, and you could either translate that as unrighteousness or injustice. I mean, the same word
oh,
can mean
yeah.
both of those things. And I think uh, it should mean both of those things when Paul talks about it. He doesn't divide right relatedness and justice. These are
Mm.
related concepts for him. They're all packed into one word for him.
Well, the problem is like righteousness is almost always looked at as our relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's where it gets to be like just so wrapped up into sin, whereas justice tends to be our relationship with our fellow human beings and living in just relationships, which is also when it goes into injustice, it's
Yeah.
like not following the God who wants justice. Right.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's how they get related
the
so well.
prophets, the Old Testament prophets,
Yes.
always held together mishpat and tzedakah,
Mm.
justice and righteousness. You could not have one without the other. And in Greek, when Greek translates those terms, it's all one word to translate both of those. So you really can't have one without the other. And the Hebrew understanding of righteousness is not just about us and God. It does pertain to us and God, but it's also our being rightly related to our neighbor, and
Yes.
specifically like meeting the demands of a specific relationship. And so the definition of righteousness can change based on what that kind of relationship demands, right? Like uh, how I'm rightly related to my mail carrier is going to be a little bit different than how I'm rightly related to my kids. Is going to be a little
Mm.
different than how I'm rightly
Hmm.
related to parishioners if I'm a pastor, right? Like
Hmm.
it's just each of those relationships is particular and has particular demands about what it means to be rightly related. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Joshua says many of us, getting to the rightly related comment, many of us, in my opinion, must overcome our selfishness in order to recognize our neighbors' empathy, compassion, or reciprocity with one
yeah,
another. I think that fits really well with what you're getting at.
yeah, yeah. That's really helpful. And then Paul is always about that. If you read the works of the flesh versus the fruit of the spirit, it's very much like that: enmity and strife and selfishness and kind of uh, all this stuff that's so self-focused, but not, it's not bad. Self-care is good. We shouldn't just
Yeah.
like punish ourselves, but to be greedy, right? To be overly focused on self, curved in on self, I think is what the reformers said.
That's good.
But
Raylene,
yet,
go ahead.
I don't want to lose the thread of atonement, because I think there's some other like sacrificial atonement stuff happening in Paul too. Not a lot, but he does mention it. Um, and I wanted to make this point. I think oftentimes our ideas of sacrifice in the Bible are so thoroughly
mm,
pagan and not
mhm,
Jewish.
mhm,
Sacrifice is not throwing the virgin into the volcano to appease a wrathful God, right? The logic of sacrifice in Leviticus is um, this is why I think it's helpful. It's also about death and life.
mm,
Jacob Milgram is such an influential interpreter of Leviticus, and he says the problems in Leviticus, the problems that Leviticus is trying to address, are problems associated with death, and the
mm,
solution is blood, not because God is bloodthirsty. That's not at all what Leviticus is getting at. It's in Leviticus 16 and 17, I think, maybe 17. I'd have to go back and look, but it's explicitly stated the blood is life, right? And so
mm,
blood is not like I demand blood, you must give me blood because I've got to kill somebody, and it's can be this animal instead of you. It's that the life kind of
mm,
covers over the deathliness. And that's why I think
mm,
that's helpful for Paul. Um, Jesus's life saves us. It's not that God has to kill Jesus because God is so mad. Um,
mm.
it's Jesus's life, and Hebrews makes this point, not by Paul, but
Yeah.
um, the power of his indestructible life is what brings us to God. So
It's such an ancient way of understanding blood and life
yeah,
and
it's
all
very
of this.
different from like our
Right.
mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's often hard to grasp our minds around. I want to you mentioned something earlier, the book Our Mother Saint Paul.
Yes.
I would love to hear more about what Our Mother Saint Paul, because many people are surprised to learn that there is an ancient Christian tradition that talks about Jesus as our mother,
Mm. Mhm.
where Jesus on the cross is birthing a new humanity, and when they poke him with the spear, it's water and blood that
Mm.
pour out of his body. Out of his flesh, and leads to the birthing of a new humanity. So there you have this ancient tradition referring to Jesus as our mother. And I'm just fascinated, like how Paul is viewed as a mother.
Well, Paul describes himself as being in labor,
Mm,
birthing his church.
mm,
In Galatians. He uses maternal metaphors a few
mm,
different times. He describes himself as a nursemaid in First Thessalonians. In the ancient world, this is not something you would do if you want to be masculine, right? You
mm.
don't use maternal imagery about yourself. The ancient world holds up masculinity as
Wow.
virtue, and so to gain honor and virtue, you wouldn't do that as a man, but Paul does over and over again. And Gaventa makes that connection, but she also makes this connection with an apocalyptic reading of Paul's uh, idea of salvation, where creation is also in labor, right? And groaning for redemption. So she makes that connection between Paul's ministry and his vision of salvation, and it is just so worth reading. Especially, there's a chapter there that is worth the price of the book. Um, the chapter is called "God Handed Them Over," which
Mm,
is so important for reading Romans, especially Romans 1. We already kind of like started to get into Romans 1, but um, where three times says God handed them over, and we always think that means, I'm kind of done with you. But actually, she reads the prophets, and then she reads another time in Romans where Paul uses that language. He uses it about Jesus. God handed over
mm,
his own son, right?
mm,
So I always say, you can't use that language about LGBTQ folks unless you're also willing to use it about Jesus, because Paul,
mm,
you know, that's what Paul does. So the logic there is not of washing one's hands of something, but um, kind of a handing over and retrieval, right? And again, we can talk about Romans
Oh, I
another
dig
time.
it.
Maybe I'd be happy to come back.
I dig it. I mean, you are getting me thinking like Paul when he's using feminine imagery for himself is transcending gender binaries. He's making himself what we would call today, and I our seminary professors would give me an F for this, but I don't care. Like he's doing some he's queer. He's beyond like these gender binaries that we usually assume, and he's going against the gender male masculine assumptions
Yeah,
or expectations of his day and taking on feminine forms, traditional feminine ideas
yeah,
of what it means to be a woman. And this is some fascinating stuff. Jesus does the
suggestive. Yeah,
same, right? It's very
yeah,
suggestive of
yeah,
queer theology and our queer theologians who are doing work on this. So it's fascinating
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. Gaventa is worth reading. That book is fantastic. So it's worth, just the title alone is amazing, right? Our Mother St. Paul.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love it. Rebecca says, where in the sand does the line divide for science and medicine get drawn when fighting for our lives?
Oh
Um,
boy. I mean, I'm
I'm
not
not sure if you have,
qualified to
yeah.
answer that one, but that's a good question. But I don't even know if I could even give a
Rebecca,
good answer to that.
Rebecca, I'll try to get to the science and religion conversation on another episode. Todd says, wow, not saved from wrath, but saved by love. Thank you for that nugget. That is a good one, Ryan. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so, spirit, we haven't even talked about spirit in relation to flesh or in opposition to flesh, but I think that's important too, because spirit doesn't mean disembodiment. Um, because Jesus is raised from the dead, embodied. Um, and so it's very clear that this is not um, anti-embodied, and it's not disparaging of embodiment. But it is, Paul makes very clear in 1 Corinthians 15, it's a transformed embodiment. It's a transformed mode
Mm-hmm.
of existence. But if we see this flesh as subject to death, or under the power of death, being towards death, frail and infirm, um, then spirit is what Hebrews says is an indestructible life, right? The life
Mm,
that Jesus lives, um, he will never die again, right? It's when Jesus raises people in the Gospels, they're being resuscitated, right? They're coming
mm,
back to life, but we understand they're going to die again. Like if Lazarus was like raised from the dead and was raised in the same way that Jesus was, he might still be around, right? But I don't think he is.
mhm.
Not now.
Poor guy has to die
Right,
twice.
right.
That's
That's the downside of being raised from the dead.
yeah.
But um, the way that Jesus is raised, he can walk through walls or through locked
Mm,
doors or whatever it is. He can disappear from before people's eyes. Like that's, none of us can do that.
mm,
Maybe magicians can make it seem like that, but none of us can do that kind of stuff. So it's a very different mode of existence, but it's clear that it's still embodied precisely because spirit, again, from Wolf's book, is about empowerment. It's about the
mm,
source of life. So if flesh is about living under the conditions of death, being subject to death, spirit is about death has been conquered.
mm.
Life reigns, and we live in a way. This is mystical, right? This is where Paul
Sure.
becomes a very mystical theologian. Um, we live in a way that is not subject to death, and we can only get a sense of that now. There's a now and not yet for Paul.
Mm,
Now we can live that way in the spirit by not falling prey to these practices that exploit each other. We don't live under the fear of scarcity. We can share. We can think about others. We can welcome others as Christ has welcomed us. That's how we live in the Spirit now. We can still die, right? We can still be killed. Paul was killed. Um, but that's how we live in the Spirit now. We live in community, generously, hospitably. Um, and the not yet is that kind of mystical transformation, that resurrection, new creation transformation that who knows exactly what that looks like.
Yeah, good, good. Rebecca asks a question that a lot of us struggle with. Why design a natural world with a pecking order? I can't seem to connect with this and beauty at the same time.
Hmm.
That's such a deep, visceral question there that gets back to the Genesis story, where if everything is good, then why why is there this rivalry? Why is there this pecking order?
Yeah, and I don't. It's my reading of the text that that pecking order is not really built into creation.
Mm,
Like, there's no sense of like um, hierarchy where some things are better or more deserving than others. Paul lives in a pecking order world, right, where the emperor, the Caesar, is on top,
yeah,
and
yeah.
some people that are close to his orbit are good, but like largely the population is poor and lives hand
Mm,
to mouth, right? Like that's a bad thing. That's Paul's world. Um, but his churches are so different than that, right? His churches are egalitarian. He's seeking to get them to share, to eat together, to have rich and poor eat together is a radical thing in Paul's world. It just doesn't happen. To have um, Jews and Gentiles did eat together in the ancient world. That I think is a misconception. Like this did happen, but
mm,
in Paul's community, it happens without there being distinctions made, right? There are still Jews and Gentiles eating together, but it's not like, well, you're separate off because, we may be eating in the same
uh,
area, but there's distinctions among us. For Paul's communities, like there's no barriers to this. Um, and to
mm,
have clearly in Paul's churches, there are female leaders. Clearly, Phoebe carries the letter to
mm,
Rome, probably reads it. Therefore, she probably also consulted with Paul about what to emphasize. So she's like the first authoritative interpreter of Roman.
mm. She is answering questions that men have about this
Yes,
book, that men and
exactly.
women have
Right.
about this book.
That's right.
Uh, the first questions, the first interpreter of Romans is a woman. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And Junia is mentioned in Romans as among the apostles, prominent among the apostles. We have another really good book that's worth checking out is Lucy Pepiat's Women in Worship in Corinth. The
Mm,
question about women in leadership in Corinth suggests that women were leading in Corinth. We tend to read that text as like ruling women out of leadership, but actually it probably means, if Paul's addressing it, it probably means that women are in leadership in Corinth in some way, shape, or form, and that they're
mm.
Pepiat's conclusion is that it's actually the men who are stirring up trouble against the women leaders that Paul is addressing and saying, "You got
Oh,
to pipe down." Like she's like, "What's the more reasonable reconstruction of this? That women are stirring up trouble or that men are acting chauvinistically?" And she's like, well, probably, knowing the ancient world, probably that the men are acting
oh,
in
that's
exclusive
interesting.
ways. It's a great book. It's
Yeah.
worth
So
reading.
what do you make of that? What passage is it? Roman or First Corinthians? Is
Yeah,
it 14 where Paul
yeah.
says women remain silent?
So sh I'm pretty convinced by her argument in general, that takes as a jumping off point the presence of Corinthian slogans that the church has written Paul a letter. We know that he mentions it, and maybe he knows from Chloe's people. He mentions that, like, I've heard from Chloe's people that there's all these divisions
Mm,
among you. So he knows either from Chloe's people or from this letter certain things that the Corinthians are believing as kind of like confessions that they pass around, slogans. One of them is "All things are permissible for me," um, or sorry, is that? I'm in Romans now.
That's
I was
okay.
looking down. Um,
That I think that's it.
yeah, but all things are lawful for me. That's what it is. That's likely a slogan. Another slogan is uh, that I think also happens right there in 1 Corinthians 6:13. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. Right? If we read that as coming
Mm,
from Paul, it sounds kind of problematic that God is
mhm.
anti-embodiment. But if that's a Corinthian slogan that Paul is quoting and then refuting, it makes a lot more sense. So she
This
takes
is
this
this.
jumping off point that there are slogans that Paul is quoting from their letter or from Chloe. Um, he mentions them and then he argues against them. And so she
Okay.
reads the instructions about women prophesying as another instance where Paul is bringing in something they've said and then refuting it. And that, to my mind, makes a lot better sense of the text because otherwise it's very muddled and confused.
This sounds like Douglas Campbell's gigantic
Yes,
work.
so she's using some of his work from Romans.
Okay.
He's doing it in Romans. And other people have also done that work about slogans in Corinth. But nobody, I think, before Pepiat has argued that 14 is also a slogan. But
Okay.
I think I'm convinced by her
That
argument.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Douglas Campbell's big book, The Deliverance of
Yeah.
God. Yeah, so if you want to get really deep in the weeds on this,
That's
go
not a
check out.
summer beach read.
No, that's good. Let's talk a little bit to wrap up about First Thessalonians and the rapture, because this is often used today, I think, in very harmful ways to talk about the material world, including your flesh, your body, is evil, and the earth is something that we have to escape. And Jesus is coming on this divine rescue mission to take us away from the earth and away from our sinful flesh and bring us up to a disembodied spiritual heaven somewhere. And is that what Paul is actually saying in First Thessalonians?
I mean, it's all of a piece, isn't it? Right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
when we get to Romans 8 and Paul says those who are in the flesh are not empowered to please God.
Mm,
It sounds like, well, I've got to be like disembodied then. But that's all about empowerment, right? If you're in the
yeah.
spirit, if you're embodied in the spirit, you can live that way. And just read the
It's
rest
about
of Romans, right?
this
It's all about
this
like living that way.
the spirit is about your body, your flesh being empowered
Yeah,
to live as followers of Christ, to do what
yeah,
Christ did, who is the ultimate model for, as you mentioned earlier, the incarnation.
right,
Right?
right.
Jesus is the spirit in the flesh, as it's always been and how it's always been meant to be.
Yes. He's the way that God always intended humanity to be.
Yeah.
Jesus is. Yeah. Yeah.
That,
So I think real fast before we move to Thessalonians, um, in Paul, most of the time when you see flesh, it has a negative connotation. But again, not a moral negative connotation. It's more about this being subject to death. It does have moral ramifications, um, but Paul also uses the word body, and
mm,
almost every time when you see body in Paul, it has positive connotation. So it's not that there's a disembodiment idea going on in Paul, it's that there seems to be some kind of thing happening between flesh and body. Flesh is living disempowered, body is living empowered by the Spirit, both personal body, right? But also communal body, the body of Christ. You're engrafted onto his humanity personally, and you're engrafted onto his humanity uh, communally. And then also when you get to Ephesians and Colossians, cosmically, right? The cosmic
mm.
body of Christ that is kind of the
Yeah.
renewal of all creation.
Yeah, this is so helpful. And it reminds me of the other, like, I think the other way that we are invited in Christian history to view atonement is not necessarily just what Jesus does on the cross, as important as
Yes.
that is, but the incarnation itself is the atonement, right? So you
Yeah.
have this at one-ment with God and human bodies
Yes.
in Christ.
Yes.
And the early Eastern theologians, I think it's Gregory of Nyssa, they define Jesus's mission not as primarily as going to the cross, but they frame it as God became flesh in Christ
Yes.
so that flesh might become
Yeah.
one with God, or
Well,
God
they even
became
say might
human that,
become God, right? Like,
right,
it's scandalous.
God be that's it. God became human that
So
humans
that
might
we might,
become
yeah.
God.
Right. And that doesn't mean that we like usurp God, but it just we become divine. And I think that's I wanted to mention David Bentley Hart's essay that I just recently read. You can find it online. It's called "The Spiritual Has More Sub," or "The Spiritual Was More Substantial Than the Material for the Ancients," which he talks
Mm,
about that spirit being like kind of unchangeable, not subject to death. He's like, that's the destiny of human life, which is a
yeah,
dignifying of embodied human life, that it's meant to
yeah,
be kind of glorified. And Paul does that kind of stuff in
mm,
Romans too. So it's
that's good.
Hart's essay is worth reading. I'm learning. Like I said, I read that essay and I was like,
Yeah,
oh, I have to rethink some things. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that's even Anselm gets a bad rap
Mm,
on this atonement thing, because I actually don't think when you go back and Anselm is usually more invoked than read, but when you go
yeah.
back and read Anselm's "Why the God Man," um, he's not saying that uh, Jesus was punished as payment, right? Like that's usually the way we think of Anselm, but that's not actually what Anselm is saying. He's saying there's
Mm,
two options.
mm,
Sin has caused a kind of ripple and rift in God's good creation, and it's what we've been talking about between God and humans, between humans and humans, and between humans and creation. It's kind of like thrown it all off balance.
mm,
And God doesn't want that to happen, right? So God has to rectify that situation either through punishment for the crime that's been committed or through repayment, right? Like a civil
mm,
lawsuit, like you got to pay damages, right?
mm, mhm,
And he says there's those two options. And the problem is the um, uh, humans cannot, or a human has to pay it because it's a human crime, but they can't repay
mm,
what has been done. Um, so Jesus comes as a human, not to be punished, because that could be done without Jesus. If God just had to
mm,
punish, God can punish the humans, right? You don't need Jesus
mhm.
for that at all. God can just say, all right, I'm punishing you for this egregious sin. You
Yeah.
don't need Jesus at all for that. Jesus comes as a human to repay the debt. And the debt is not death, the debt is obedience, right? The problem was
Mm,
disobedience, the problem
mm,
was sin. So the payment is obedience, and it's so his obedience to the point of death. It's not
mm.
obedience to death, it's obedience to God even when he'll be killed by
This relates to
God.
Paul
Yeah.
because Paul talks about what is it? Paul talks about it's either gets translated as faith in Christ or the
Oh, yeah.
faith of
Yes,
Christ.
yes. And
So
yeah, Anselm is all about the faith of Christ.
so
Yeah.
Anselm would interpret that
Well,
as
I mean,
like
I don't know.
obedience.
He wouldn't know
Sure,
that debate, but
sure,
as
yeah,
I
yeah,
read Anselm, he's squarely on the like faithful life of obedience that ends up on the cross, because Jesus is not going to shy away from obedience to God, even when it's going to cost him being arrested and killed by
and
Jewish and Roman authorities.
yeah, and obedience to God's will is to live out this
Love.
radically loving,
Yes.
uh, radically welcoming
Yep.
way of life that is God. And when you live into that in a world that exists on the uh, um, fleshly desires of us against them, in order so that we can feel,
Right.
I don't know, righteous or false sense of righteousness or whatever.
Or we
That's
can feel
going
insiders. We can be the inside group and exclude others. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And so when you enter into a world that is based on that kind of division, it's going to end up putting you up on the cross. So it's what I'm getting from you and Anselm. It's the faithfulness of Christ to be to live out God's desires for a more loving and just world that gets Jesus killed, not by God, but
Yeah.
by his fellow human
And
beings.
that's the thing that atones is Jesus's life. Jesus's love
Yeah.
and obedience is the payment, the repayment, and
Uh,
it's human repayment,
that's a huge
but it's
shift.
done perfectly because he's incarnate, right? He's God
Mm.
incarnate. So Anselm, I think, gets such a bad rap because he didn't. I don't really think Anselm invented penal substitutionary atonement, like,
Oh.
because that's not the logic of penal substitutionary atonement. That is something else, right? Because if God needs to punish sin, God does not need Jesus for that.
Mm.
But in
Mm.
Anselm's thing, Jesus comes to live the obedience that is necessary to restore human life with God. And it's just
Yeah,
lovely.
as a Protestant, I try to own the fact that penal substitutionary atonement is a Protestant heresy, and
Yeah.
some of our Catholic friends have unfortunately fallen into the Protestant heresy of penal substitutionary
Right.
atonement. But uh,
Yeah, to get to
so
First Thessalonians though, real fast. I won't
yes, let's do
dwell a
that.
whole lot, but it's all of a piece, right? Like, so if it's disembodiment at the individual level, personal level, can lead to this kind of disembodiment from the cosmic level. And so what had been translated or interpreted for a long time as rapture theology, which I think is just not there.
Yeah.
Barbara Rossi, you like Barbara Rossi too, I know, and her book, The Rapture Exposed, is so helpful on this. Rapture theology is just mostly just made up, and then cobbled together verses that are read poorly. Um, but when Paul talks about the return of Christ and meeting Jesus in the air, he's using terms cribbed from the Roman imperial system, which would a city would know that like the Caesar or a very important person from Rome was coming. An
Mm.
outlying city would know they're going to get a visit, and so they'd post like a watch person on the walls, right, to look for the arrival of this person. And as they would come out, they would sound the alarm. They'd say they're on their way. Get the
Mm.
welcoming committee out there so we can like escort this person back into the city with a parade and a celebration so that they know they're being welcomed in the right way, right?
Mm. Mm.
And that's the language. uh, Parousia and apantesis are the two Greek words that Paul is using from Greco-Roman logic of that visitation, and he's applying it to what's going to happen at the return of Jesus, to say like it's not we're going to get out of here; it's Jesus is coming back to reign here, and that's good news, right? King Jesus is coming back to be the good king who will rule with justice,
Mm.
um, which is precisely what we get at the end of Revelation, too. The
Yeah.
New Jerusalem comes down from heaven to earth. The movement is downward,
Mm.
earthly, not escapist. So um, I think if we get rid of a disembodiment interpretation of flesh, we will also have the tools to not understand salvation as kind of escape and disembodiment in
Mm.
the more cosmic terms too.
So the Perusia, with that ancient Roman understanding, would be when the people are lifted up and they go to Jesus,
The
they would be
the
the
Parousia
ones.
is the arrival of the important person, and the
Okay.
apantesis is the meeting.
Ah, okay.
And so that the apantesis, so First Corinthians or First Thessalonians, I'm sorry, he says, uh, We who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. So that meet
Ah,
um, is apantesis, and that's the welcoming committee, right? But
mhm.
that caught up idea, caught up in the clouds, um, we read this Son of Man coming in the clouds uh, as like escaping. But the way
Yeah.
Daniel uses it is enthronement language.
Mm.
Jesus being enthroned as king, not to get us all out of here, but to rule over creation well.
I love it. And
And so caught up in the clouds is caught up in that like establishment of his rule.
yeah, yeah, and the meeting up in the clouds or whatever is not to stay there or to go
To welcome
somewhere
him back.
else,
Yeah,
right?
right.
It's to be the welcoming committee to come back
Yeah.
to the earth.
Yeah, because when Caesar would come into an outlying city, he wouldn't then take all of those citizens of that city back to Rome, right?
Mm,
That would be
mm,
weird.
yeah.
It's it's more about establishing Caesar's authority over that city,
Mm.
which, you know, in the Roman mind was good news, but often it was bad news for a lot of
This
folks.
this is for another podcast, so maybe we can get here. Um, do do you see a lot of folks are for good reason wanting to keep wanting to make Christianity non-political.
Mm,
Uh, and there are times when there's a good reason for that. When politics becomes about power and coercion over and against others.
yeah,
But at the same time, hearing you talk about uh, Paul's use of these Roman terms, Jesus's use of I mean the word gospel is
mhm,
a Roman term that the early Christians hijacked. It's a Roman political term that the early Christians hijacked. Calling Jesus son of God is also, I mean, has it's hugely
yeah.
political in the ancient Roman Empire. Do you see all of this language as being overtly or covertly political subversion of that Jesus is doing against Rome and that Paul is making against Rome as well? Or how intentional
Yeah.
do you think that is?
Well, the word gospel is also a Jewish term picked up from Isaiah um, about like return of exile, right?
Mm,
Like how beautiful, Paul quotes this, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good
mm,
news of peace, right? Like
mm.
that's political.
Yeah.
Um, so both the Jewish version and the Greco-Roman version are both, and Paul is working with both of those. They're both just inescapably political. Like all scripture in general is inescapably political. Um, to Jesus is called the Son of David, and you got to
Yeah.
go back to read like the David narratives. That's the height and fall of Israel's
Yeah.
kingship, um, and so they're anticipating another king.
Mm,
Call Jesus the Son of David, and he doesn't say, "Don't call me the Son of David." Oftentimes, he
mm,
will say like, "Don't call me the Messiah," etc., etc. But like he he welcomes, I think, some of those connotations of the Son of David. Uh, it's a complex, like you say,
yeah.
probably another conversation. It's a complex question. It's a good question. I think briefly, the question is, how are we to be political? Not
Mhm.
are we to be political? I
Good.
just finished teaching a class on the book of Acts this week, and um, we read a book in that class by Kevin Rowe, Rowe, called World Upside Down, which I think not a beach read, but
Uh-huh.
uh, it is so utterly helpful in the way he talks about the early church's message about Jesus clashing with the
Mhm,
Roman gospel of Caesar.
mhm.
He calls it a collision. He says it's an inescapable collision, right? These are gonna collide. But then he reads the narratives of Paul's trials in Acts in such an interesting way. Paul is constantly being put on trial in the last third of the book. Um, and the question is he committing sedition? right? Is he trying to overthrow Caesar and Rome? And every time he's found as innocent. Actually, the word is righteous, which can be translated innocent or just, right? So, like,
Yeah.
every time the verdict is no, he's not trying to overthrow Caesar. So Roe holds these two things in tension as he reads Acts. Is like, it's gonna be a message that does turn the world upside down, but it's not competing for the same power as Caesar. And I like to say, the kingdom of God does not participate in the Game of Thrones.
Yeah, yeah. I love it. I
It's
love it.
nonviolent.
So, yeah, so it's not Paul trying to overthrow Caesar in order to
And take
become
his
just
throne.
a
Yeah.
yeah, in order to become just a bigger, more violent Caesar,
Yes.
right? It's
Right.
the overthrow of Rome in order to, I don't know, institute the realm of God, the nonviolent, loving, non-coercive realm of God.
Yeah, I think the two options that means are coercion or conversion,
Yeah,
right? Is an
yeah.
invitation to have a converted mindset,
Mm,
to see things in a new way, which is what repentance is, and to um, participate in the new community that God is building. But it's not coercive. It's not seeking to make everyone do that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, Ryan, thank you so
Yeah.
much for this conversation. Always fun. I always learn so much from talking with you. So thank you for being here.
Oh man, I love being here. It's really fun to talk to you and good to see you, Adam. And to
Same.
all the folks participating, such good questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. We will do this again next Thursday at 11 o'clock Pacific. What is my outro, Ryan? I can never remember. Thank you all for being here. And if you want to keep up with One Question with Pastor Adam, you can do so on YouTube, on Facebook, at the Clackamas United Church of Christ page, the Pastor Adam page. You can also check out all of the podcasts on the Raven Foundation website, ravenfoundation.org, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you listen to a podcast where you can rate or review, I would love it. And that would help to get the message out. And feel free to share this video with anybody who you think is interested. And Rebecca, thank you for being here. I think one of the big answers, Rebecca, to your question about like the why did God make a world where there could be these hierarchies is exactly how we ended. That God is non-coercive. God's not going to force us to live in a certain way, and this leads to the ability to construct the world in whatever way we want or whatever way we happen to fall into. But we also have ways of constructing the world that looks a little bit more like the realm of God that Jesus is talking about and that Paul is getting at. And sometimes that means causing a little bit of good trouble, like John Lewis invites us to. So I don't know, that's one of the best answers that I've found to your really great question, Rebecca, that you asked earlier today. So anyway, friends, thank you for being here. We'll do it again next week and hope you have a great rest of your day. Ryan, once again, thank you so much for being here. And friends, we'll talk again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.